Welcome to Wonderland Unlocked. I'm Courtney, a certified peer support specialist, and this is Series 2, Through the Rabbit Hole, the beginning of self-discovery. I've fallen down my own rabbit hole, questioning everything along the way. Now, I'm here to support you as you explore the unknown, challenge what you believe, and uncover who you really are. Take a deep breath. The rabbit hole is waiting. Let's unlock Wonderland together. Hello and welcome back to Wonderland Unlocked. I'm really excited to dive into a topic that feels incredibly raw and vulnerable for me, and probably for you too. Emotions. Those wild, unpredictable, sometimes overwhelming feelings that can make you feel like you're spinning out of control. We've all been there, haven't we? You might feel like your emotions are running the show, and you're just a passenger along for the ride. Maybe you've even wished you could turn them off for a bit, just to get some relief. Well, today we're going to unravel the mystery of emotions and explore why they can feel so chaotic, why they run so deep, and most importantly, how we can start to understand and cope with them in a way that feels empowering. I'm going to share my own story, how I've struggled with overwhelming emotions, and how I've learned to understand them better, the coping strategies that have all made the difference in my journey. But we're not just going to talk about my personal experience. We're going to dive into the science behind why our emotions feel the way we do, why they sometimes feel so intense, why do we sometimes react instead of respond, how can we make sense of it all, and is it possible to regain control? Spoiler alert, yes it is, but it takes time, patience, and practice. So grab a cup of tea or coffee, get comfy, and let's take a walk through Wonderland, where we're going to explore the full spectrum of emotions, from the highs of joy and happiness to the depths of sadness, anger, and fear. And along the way, I'm going to offer you some tools to help you manage those feelings, so you don't have to be at the mercy of them anymore. Before we can understand how to manage emotions, we need to understand what emotions are and why they exist in the first place. Emotions are much, much more than just fleeting feelings. They are a fundamental part of being human. When we experience an emotion, our brains and bodies are reacting to something in our environment. Whether external or internal, emotions are deeply tied to our survival instincts. Think about fear. When we're afraid, our bodies automatically react, preparing us to fight, flee from danger. This is all happening in the background of our consciousness without us even having to think about it. It's a natural response meant to protect us. However, not all emotions are tied to life or death situations. Emotions also help us navigate our relationships, communicate with others, and process our internal world. The truth is, emotions aren't inherently good or bad. They just are. It's how we respond to them that makes all the difference. For me, emotions were always like a storm inside. There were times when I couldn't tell whether I was angry, sad, or something else entirely. My emotional landscape was so chaotic, it felt like I was living in a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. I had no idea how to stop the storm. But over time, I began to realize that understanding these emotions, even the overwhelming ones, was the key to gaining control. Once I started to grasp what each emotion was telling me, I could learn to respond with intention, rather than react out of habit or fear. At a psychological level, emotions are processed in several regions of the brain, but one key player is the amygdala. The amygdala processes emotional reactions, particularly fear, when you encounter a perceived threat. It goes into action, triggering the fight or flight response, which releases stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. This can explain why we sometimes feel completely overwhelmed or even paralyzed when emotions run high. There's the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and decision making. It's also where we process our emotions in a more thoughtful, deliberate way. When emotions are at their peak, the prefrontal cortex often takes a back seat, which explains why it can be so hard to think clearly in the heat of the moment. But with practice, you can strengthen your ability to pause and think before reacting, allowing the prefrontal cortex to take control. The body, too, plays a major role in emotions. If you've ever noticed tightness in your chest, a racing heart, or a lump in your throat when you're upset, you experience what is called a somatic response. Your body is physically reacting to the emotion you're feeling. The connection between our emotions and our bodies is incredibly strong, and understanding that connection is the first step in learning to manage our emotions more effectively. Now, let's dive deeper into the emotional roller coaster. Why do emotions sometimes feel so overwhelming, even when the situation doesn't seem that extreme? For me, the intensity of my emotions was something I struggled with for a long time. There were moments where my emotions felt like they were controlling me rather than the other way around. If something small set me off, maybe an offhand comment or a minor setback, I would find myself completely consumed by anger or frustration. It wasn't just a momentary feeling. It was like my whole world was overshadowed by this one emotion. It was exhausting, and I didn't know how to make it stop. One reason emotions can feel so intense is emotional sensitivity. Some people, like me, are naturally more sensitive to emotions. In fact, studies show that highly sensitive individuals, HSPs, experience emotional stimuli more deeply, which can make both positive and negative emotions feel more intense. If you tend to feel emotions deeply, this is something you may be familiar with. But there's another factor at play: past trauma and unresolved emotional wounds. When we experience emotional trauma in our lives, it leaves a mark in our psyche. If we don't address these wounds, they can resurface in times of stress or difficulty, amplifying our emotional responses. For me, emotional regulation didn't just involve learning to cope with the present. It also meant addressing past hurts that were still impacting how I felt in the present. One of the reasons emotions can feel so overpowering is that they haven't been fully processed. I used to bottle up my feelings because I didn't know how to deal with them. I thought that if I ignored them, they would just go away. But in reality, unprocessed emotions don't disappear. They accumulate, often intensifying over time. If you're constantly stuffing down your emotions, whether through distraction, avoidance, or denial, they'll eventually come out in unhealthy ways. This could look like outbursts, numbness, or emotional shutdowns. I've experienced this firsthand. When I didn't allow myself to feel what I was going through, I would reach a point where I couldn't suppress it any longer. It was like a pressure cooker that finally exploded, a teapot ready to burst. So now that we understand why emotions can feel so intense, how do we actually cope with them when we get out of control? How do we stop the emotional storm from taking over our lives? I'm going to share with you some strategies that have helped me, and I know they can probably help you too, but these strategies don't always work for everybody, so feel free to try them out whenever you are upset and different times, because not every moment is the same. These aren't quick fixes, but over time they can help you develop a deeper understanding of your emotional world and give you the tools to regain control. Validation. The first step in managing your emotions is to validate them. When you feel something, it's important to acknowledge the emotions and recognize that it's valid. So many times I'd dismiss my feelings as too much or not important enough. But when I started allowing myself to feel without judgment, I noticed a shift. I stopped rejecting my emotions and I started to listen to them. Mindfulness. Mindfulness is another tool that has been instrumental in my emotional regulation journey. When you practice mindfulness, you're not trying to avoid your emotions. You're simply observing them. This can be incredibly powerful because it creates a gap between stimulus and responses. Instead of reacting impulsively, you can pause and choose to how to respond. For me, mindfulness practicing, like focusing on my breath and staying present, helped me break free from the emotional spirals. Grounding techniques. When emotions feel like they're about to overwhelm you, grounding exercises can help you regain control. One simple technique is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method, where you name 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. This exercise helps distract you from your emotional state and brings you back to the present moment. Another grounding tool I've used is holding on to something cold like a piece of ice. The shock to your system can snap you out of an emotional state and ground you back into reality, or even an ice pack on your head. Breathing exercises. When emotions run wild, your body's fight or flight responses kick in, which can lead to shallow, rapid breathing. Deep breathing is a simple, effective way to activate the nervous system, which helps you calm down. One of my go-to breathing exercises is the 4-7-8 technique. Here's how it works. Breathe in through your nose for 4 seconds. Hold your breath for 7 seconds. Exhale slowly through your mouth for 8 seconds. I remember when I first started using this technique during moments of intense anger or anxiety, I'd feel my body slowly release its grip on tension. It was like I was pressing a reset button for my emotions. It took practice, but over time, I was able to use breathing as a tool to interrupt emotional spirals. Journaling. Another powerful tool I've used to process my emotions is journaling. When I started journaling regularly, it became a safe space where I could express my feelings without fear of judgment. Writing things down allowed me to get everything out of my head and onto paper, which was incredibly therapeutic. I also used journaling as a way to track my emotional patterns, what triggered certain feelings, and how I responded. This helped me recognize patterns in my emotional responses and gave me the insight to choose different responses in the future. And lastly, DBT skills, distress tolerance and emotional regulation. One of the most valuable things I learned in my mental health journey was dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, is a therapy that focuses on helping individuals manage intense emotions, develop healthy coping skills, and improve interpersonal relationships. The skills I've learned in DBT had a profound impact on my emotional regulation. Some specific techniques that help me are radical acceptance, where you fully accept your emotions without judgment, and self-soothing, which can be as simple as listening to calming music or taking a warm bath. I want to dive deeper into my personal journey. It wasn't always as neat and tidy as it may sound in those quick tips, but there was a time when my emotions truly ran wild. It wasn't that I didn't want to be in control. In fact, that's the thing that haunts someone who struggles with emotional regulation. The constant desire to control and yet never feeling fully in control. For much of my life, I was so disconnected from my emotions that I didn't even know what I was feeling half of the time. I would find myself in situations where my heart would race, my palms would sweat, and I couldn't breathe, but I didn't know why. Anger would boil up inside of me, and I couldn't explain it. I'd lash out at people I loved, feeling like I was losing myself, and I had no idea how to stop it. It was like this uncontrollable storm inside of me. And the more I tried to fight it, the worse it got. There was a pivotal moment in my life that pushed me to stop and say, enough. What is happening to me? Why am I feeling this way? Why can't I control this chaos in my head and heart? It wasn't just about the anger. It wasn't just about the sadness or anxiety. It was the confusion. The total sense of being lost in a whirlwind of emotions that made no sense. This happened about 1.5 years ago. It felt like a breaking point. I reached a moment where I thought I couldn't live this way anymore. I felt like a shell of myself. I would wake up and not know what kind of day it would be. Would I be in a good mood? Or would my emotions crash down on me like a ton of bricks? I'd been feeling more and more isolated even when I was with friends or family. I felt like I wasn't really there. My emotions would feel so overwhelming that I would just shut down and retreat. I remember a moment that stands out vividly. It was after a particularly difficult argument with someone close to me. I was furious, absolutely enraged, and I didn't understand why. The fight escalated so quickly, and I ended up saying things that I didn't mean. I couldn't stop myself, and afterward, I felt hollow. I felt like a completely different person, one that I didn't even recognize. It was like I'd been hijacked by my emotions I didn't understand. That night, I went to bed and I cried myself to sleep. I remember lying in bed, my thoughts racing, and I couldn't stop asking myself, why is this happening? Why do I feel like this? And then I asked myself something that changed everything. What if I'm not broken? What if this doesn't have to be my reality? That's when I began my journey into truly understanding emotional regulation. I realized I had been living my life in a state of constant reaction, not action. I was responding to my emotions as if they were some external force that controlled me. I hadn't been aware of my triggers or my emotional patterns, and that's when everything began to change. At first, I started reading about dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which had been recommended to me by my dad. I didn't fully grasp it at first, but as I dove deeper into it, something clicked. I remember being so stuck by one concept in DBT, the idea of radical acceptance. It's a simple idea, but revolutionary. It's about fully accepting your emotions as they are, without judgment. Before this, I had lived so much of my life resisting my feelings. I judged myself for being too angry, too sad, and too anxious. I believed I shouldn't be feeling these things. Radical acceptance taught me that it wasn't the emotions themselves that were the problem. It was the resistance to them. I had spent so much energy trying to fight my emotions, but it wasn't until I started accepting them that I began to make real progress. One specific memory that stands out was when I was hit with a wave of sadness. So deep I felt like I couldn't breathe. In the past, I would have immediately shut down, tried to distract myself or lash out. But that day, I tried something different. I allowed myself to feel the sadness. I didn't try to control it, and I didn't try to run from it. I let it wash over me like a storm. But I stayed grounded. I took deep breaths. I told myself it was okay to feel what I was feeling, and that feeling sad didn't make me weak. I stayed in the moment, letting the sadness be there without judgment, and within an hour, it started to dissipate. It was like I had learned to ride the wave of my emotions instead of trying to fight it. I began to understand that my emotions weren't a sign of weakness or instability. They were signals, telling me something I needed to know. Whether it was anger signaling a boundary that had been crossed, or sadness showing me something I had lost, my emotions had meaning. And when I started listening, I realized how much power I had over my emotional landscape. But it wasn't just about accepting emotions. I had to learn how to respond to them. I started learning skills to better regulate my emotions, like mindfulness. One of the most challenging but ultimately rewarding practices was mindfulness. It taught me to stay present. The more I practiced being mindful, the less I spiraled. When I felt myself getting caught up in the intensity of an emotion, I would pause and breathe. I would bring my attention to the here and now, noticing what I could see, hear, and feel. In those moments, I felt more in control. And even though it's been a journey, it's one that I wouldn't trade for anything. Yes, I still have my moments where my emotions get the best of me, but now I have the tools and understanding to move through those moments with much more grace. It's like the emotional roller coaster, it's still there, but now I have the seatbelt to keep myself secure. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with something important. You are not your emotions. They don't define you. They are part of you, but they don't control you. I know it's difficult. I know it's messy, but I promise you, you're not alone in this. As I share my story with you, I hope that you find pieces of yourself in it. If you're struggling with emotions running wild, take heart. There are tools, there are strategies, and most importantly, there is hope. Keep learning, keep growing, and above all, keep being kind to yourself. You're on a journey, and it's okay to not have all the answers yet. But as long as you're moving forward, you're making progress. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for sharing this space with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep unlocking your own wonderland.